So the agenda for this topic is, so I'll basically talk about what configuration means in Nephio, and the kind of controllers that are there in Nephio. And I mean, the configuration topic is kind of also covered in the previous slides. And then an example use case, basically, which is going to be a complete multi-domain network function topology intent. And so what we will see is that basically by having configuration, which is by now we know that configuration in Nephio means the KRM objects, which are packaged as the KPT bundles, and these KPT bundles are reconciled by, I mean, package deployment controllers, or there could be a domain specific controller. So what we will see is that for a multi-domain network service intent, which is basically comprising of the core, the RAN, as well as the transport, we can have the KPT functions, the KPT packages defining the 5G core, which is already covered in the previous demo. 5G core CNFs, or the GNB related CNFs, which are basically the CUs and the DUs, and then the KPT packages, which are for the day and which could be for the day and configuration of the transport network, or basically a controller like O1 controller, which is for the configuration of the RAN. And by having these per domain controller and per domain configuration packages, and the whole pipeline of basically hydrating these packages, running CI pipelines, deploying them to the target clusters, and followed by that, combining this all with the network function intent itself, and the network service intent itself. And the network service intent will basically specify the intent over basically all the three domains, and then how a controller basically can reconcile a network service intent, break it down to further intents or CRs, which are basically understood and reconciled by the per domain controllers or the configuration controllers, which could be a controller like O1 controller or a transport network controller. So that is the so I mean, this presentation has more of ideas. So most of these controllers, they don't exist today, other than the 5G core controller, which is already demonstrated. So I spoke about it. So configuration in Nephio, by now we all know that Kubernetes is the basis of all of the Nephio, which makes it declarative. And the configuration in Nephio are the KRM objects. And the Kubernetes resources, basically these KRM objects are consumed in Nephio to provision the CNFs, or to provision the workloads, to provision the infrastructure, like what we saw in the previous demo, or to do the day-end configurations of these of the network service or network functions that we deploy. And configuration is KPT bundle, like now we know it already. And these KPT packages are basically, we know that they are stored and managed in Git repos or other kind of OCI kind of, for example, OCI repository. The example, I mean, of Nephio configurations could be like what I showed in the last demo, a KPT package which defines the infrastructure, which defines a Kubernetes cluster, and it is cloud agnostic. I mean, any cloud provider that we and I mean that the user wants to use, or it could be Metal as well, but we have to have the required controllers to do that. And there could be a KPT package which is basically comprising of KRM object, which has the configuration or the KRM resources to create network functions. For example, create a UPF or create a CU or a DU. And similarly, KPT packages can also be created for the configuration, the day end configuration. For example, I mean, you have some O1 related configuration, the base configuration created, and then have a controller which would basically reconcile to that high level intent, curate that configuration, and basically hydrate it as per the requirement of the GNB, for example. So that is about configuration in Nephio. And controllers in Nephio, I mean, there are two kind of controllers, we can say. One is the regular operator kind of operator controller, which are the control loops, and their job is to make sure that like what is specified in the intent always matches the actual state of the deployment. Or the other kind of controllers are the injectors. So these controllers are the ones which basically hydrate the packages, which curate the packages. So there could be a series of these injectors which can do their job maybe in sequence and create a package dynamically for the deployment. So this is the examples we already saw of, I mean, the example of these kind of injectors. For example, the IPAM injector and the network function injector that we saw in the previous demo. So a network function injector basically injected a whole injected a whole deployment object for a UPF, and the IPM injector basically allocated IP addresses, and I mean the other there was one more injector which further curated the package and created the network attachment definitions, etc. So these are the two type of controllers, and that's what I have in the example. So now, the beginning of the slide, I stated that I mean following these design principles and methodologies, how can we basically create a whole multi-domain network service with day-end configurations. So we'll start looking at the individual pieces first. So this slide describes the deployment flow of a CNF, and so as the user specifies a 5GC topology intent, and that intent is reconciled by the 5GC controller. And as a result of it, it basically creates the package deployment custom resource. And then the package deployment controller will basically work on a base 5G core package. And with the help of the config injectors, it will create the package dynamically for the deployment as per the intent which was there in the 5GC topology. This is what was demonstrated by Wim, in which he showed that UPF, I mean, by specifying a 5GC topology intent, basically UPF was created, UPF deployment and config map was created and deployed in the target cluster. So similar concept can be followed for GNB as well. I mean, we could have a GNB controller which understands the configurations of CUDU, for example, and it would.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So each of these controllers needs to be created first. So for the moment, you have only controller for 5G core, GNB, and etc. But you want to have new controller, you need to create it and write and develop it.
Exactly. So these controllers, as I said, they don't exist today. So these are more of ideas, and yeah. So we have to develop a GNB controller, and similarly in further slides, I'm talking about O1 controller or transport controller. So we have to develop them. But what is developed already is the 5GC controller. So that is what was demonstrated in the previous demo by Wim. That is also a work in progress, but it is there. I mean, you can try it out and have yeah, have the whole flow. I mean, test it out yourself.
Does it support the REST-conf API for the 5GC controller?
So 5GC controller, it does not support REST-conf API. So it will basically, it's CRD and it expects a custom resource to be created as in order to specify the intent. Yeah. So this is, yeah, so this slide basically it shows the CNF deployment part. And this is how we can automate the process of deployment of core and RAN. So then comes, I mean, once we have core RAN deployed, then comes the day end configurations, right? I mean, if we talk about RAN, then there is this whole O1 SMO and O1 specification using which the CUDUs RUs are configured. So what this slide shows is basically it is a proposal, an idea of an O1 controller. And it's a similar concept. The base configuration will reside in a repo so that we could have GitOps here. And the user specifies high-level O1 intent, which is reconciled by the O1 controller. And the O1 controller basically, as part of the reconciliation, it adds or hydrates the base configuration and creates a custom resource, another CR, which can be understood by a netconf controller. So I'm calling this a netconf controller because it will talk netconf in the southbound to the CUs and DUs. So I mean, yeah, so that is basically the flow at a high level, and the netconf controller will keep reconciling to this intent, the O1 intent that is specified. It is a proposal, I mean, which basically says that there is a separate netconf controller and a separate O1 controller. We could have a O1 controller which has the capability to talk netconf in the southbound, I mean, a single controller. But that will be, I mean, RAN specific or O1 specific. Just a thought, I thought if we have a netconf controller, I mean, netconf specific controller, it can be used for other domains as well. It's like a reusable kind of controller. And the configurations basically which this controller will reconcile to, right? So they can either be applied manually, or these CRs that are created, which this O1 controller reconciles to, they can be result of the service assurance closed loop. I mean, that's how I imagine it happening in a real world scenario. So in similar lines to the O1 controller that I described, right? So now, I mean, we have the GNB, we have the core, so we have to configure the backhaul or the XHAul. So we can have a controller which is a transport controller, and this controller can basically it can create configuration for switches, routers, the XHAul switches. And depending on the kind of device, I mean, we can either use REST-conf controller or netconf controller here, which will basically reconcile the transport CRs which are created by the transport controller. Yeah, so this is basically a very high level idea at present. And then combining it all. So
there is
what this show.
Sorry, Cindy. There is a question in the chat window.
Okay.
why the netconf controller is running on the management cluster. Shouldn't it be running on the target edge cluster?
So that is also possible. I mean, we can run the netconf controller in the edge cluster also. And in that case, the CR or the configuration that we create, it would basically go to the corresponding repo of the edge cluster. So it basically will boil down to the left shift versus right shift terminology that we discussed in the previous slide. But yeah, I mean, this slide does not say that it has to run on the management cluster only. It could be the edge cluster as well.
Sandeep, since you're using the ORAN terminology for O1 and O2 interfaces, and
Yeah.
both of these are managed under their SMO standards, do you expect that Nephio will play SMO role?
So Nephio will not play a SMO role, but somebody can build a controller, O1 controller or the O2 controller, right? I mean, following the Nephio design principles, and yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you.
So I think the O1 control, I mean, the SMO will be part of the higher level SMO on top of Nephio, which will use this O1 controller to manage the deployment of the O1 itself on the different cluster. That's my understanding.
That's
So
right.
it is also,
Yes, if I understand right, it might be just a microservice being instantiated for O1 controller services by
Yes, that's my
Nephio.
understanding. Yeah,
Okay,
that's my understanding.
thank you. Okay, cool. Thank you.
okay. Yeah, so this slide, basically I covered it all. So what we are showing here is that now the intent is specified at the network service level. And this controller is now creating like per domain CRs for the controllers that I just talked about. And those controllers will basically do their job and create the custom resources for netconf, restconf, or some other, protocol. And they will configure the devices that they are, managing. So Brandon, hello. Brandon, are you there?
Mr. Wick?
You're
So
on
as
mute, my
Vivek-
dear.
I am on mute.
Yes, Sandeep.
Hey, Vivek. You joined. So
So can I ask once again a bit of a stupid question here? It does seem as though there's a very interesting, and we were having a little bit of a sidebar chat, earlier about Iran and Nephio and how they work together. It sounds to me a little bit, and this is sort of, I think, also maybe Udasar's question, that one of the things is sort of maybe a little bit of a reset on sort of design principle alignment, but from there, assuming, that there is general support for that sort of approach, that it can make it potentially quite easy for ORAN to make things that work well with Nephio, kind of following some of those principles for the, RAN specific things, that are definitely special and complicated. And, maybe a similar sort of working model with some of the features and functions that ONAP works on, that there might be some level of I guess, design principle sort of, I guess, meeting of the minds. But from there, it could become quite easy for, the various projects in this ecosystem to create things that work well with each other, fairly out of the box, going back to that sort of interoperability sort of, issue that I think is the bugbear of, all complicated industry ecosystems.
Yeah. So that is the vision. I mean, you put it, yeah, I mean, correctly. So that is the vision. But yeah, as you said, right, it is going to be a collaborative move.
Yeah.
All players have to contribute
Yeah.
and collaborate. So I mean, these ideas are high level. So we are back in the community. We are still gathering requirements, and yeah,
So-
talking to the yeah.
Heather, so continuing based on what you said, in general, if we consider, for instance, ONAP as a kind of playground that we can take from, so this approach, Nephio, brings a kind of new interface or new glue on top of that. But the logic of the operators, for instance, can be taken from some of the components of ONAP, and it's just a matter of encapsulating them into the Kubernetes operators so that they expose required CRDs, and then they can be controlled or steered through this paradigm, through the CRs that will be later on controlled in this package management flow defined by Nephio. That's how I see this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, if I'm looking at advantages, right, if it does require, some work within ONAP, some work within OREN, that it's sort of us maybe sharing some of this package management paradigm that we've sort of had to, we've all been sort of working
Definitely.
on our own a little bit in the wilderness, right?
And
Oh, sorry, go on.
And the split, I think, on who and what, I think, is quite clear, because ORAN can help really to standardize how this CRDs should look. So what will be the CR form at the end to be used by the operators? And then the implementation, for instance, of the operator that will consume these CRs will be on the ONAP side, while the in general processing of the entire flow with this management of this packages comes with Nephio, right? And all together, it's possible to glue on all of them together in this way, right?
Yeah. So agree.
Sandy,
So from the
sorry.
yeah, please.
Sandy, I have a question. I think looking at the network service, initially I was thinking of a scope. Looks like Nephio management cluster, they manage multiple workload cluster. That means if you reflect the OREN architecture, Nephio management cluster and the Nephio functionality can be sitting part of the SMO to me. Initially, I think network service handled by SMO level, and then controlling the Nephio in the workload cluster. But looking at the again, and then you have a Nephio management cluster, and then you applying the network services. Of course, the full end-to-end, we need some kind of NFO, but this one Nephio the scope can be extended. I think the network services, that means you handling part of the SMO, but not just all cloud, but the decorative centric, JIT centric, different paradigm. I think you can handle some of the SMO function. That's my observation today. Is that right?
Yeah. So that is my thought. I mean, that is how I presented it. But whether SMO sits on top of Nephio or part of SMO is like that is in the Nephio management cluster, like I showed. So those, I mean, yeah. So that eventually we will figure out. But what I showed is a possibility, like you were saying, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Björk, to me, in this approach, let's say SMO is decoupled into the set of the Kubernetes operators, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you can deploy them centrally, or you can again, decentralize it on each edge. It's, I think,
Yeah.
up to the design, and then by the proper labeling on the level of the CRs and so on, then you may just apply this concrete CR into the concrete cluster and then being served by the operator there. But again, then such operator needs to be first implemented, right?
Implemented, yeah.
Yeah.
So what you get is the distributed actuation of the intent, which is, but yeah, I mean, first these operators.
Well, as I understand, here we just based on the Kubernetes infrastructure. So the distribution of the CRs across different nodes of the clusters or across different clusters, this is something that Nephio may help with, right, along with the Kubernetes. Yeah. But still, the main part of the logic is still sitting inside the implementation of the operators, which are or a matter of the future implementation within Nephio, or cooperation with ONAP, or something separate, or even third-party operators. But anyway, the Kubernetes operators is still the core functionality here that is just doing the things.
Yes, I think that's my understanding. We define a declarative definition and declarative API, but actually they are connecting that to operator, vendor provider. They are doing actual work, but all the pipeline, and I think they're more declarative. I think that's what my understanding. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Good. And we may have time for one more quick question.
It's not a question, Kenny, but just suggestion. If we keep it service oriented, I think a lot of these capability will play how MNOs want to use it. In some cases, they may just want to use it as a O2 microservice. In some cases, they may use it as a full orchestration solution for RAN.
So as I understood, you were saying that, okay, can you please repeat the suggestion?
Yeah, so if it's a service oriented, for example, when you're building SMO, right? SMO is going to be a bunch of microservices, and some of the services will be associated with management aspect, OEM aspect, some will be interface aspects, right? So if we can create an architecture that provides these capabilities, in some cases, SMO will own the management application, but the management application then requires reaching out to interfaces to communicate the intent. And those communication microservices, whether it's O2, O1, or backhaul management, that can be served by the Nephio.
Okay. Okay, understood. Yeah, I'll take a note of it. Thanks.
Okay, Sandeep, thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank you.
your presentation and the one before. Go ahead.